Please subscribe to our channel, Pacific Front Untold, and be sure to leave a comment after watching a video.
In today's video, we'll be discussing the tragic Bataan Death March of 1942 and the events that led up to it. What led to the US's crushing defeat at the Battle of Bataan? Why was Japan grossly unprepared for these new prisoners of war? And what was the journey like for thousands of Filipino and American soldiers? Right after the attack on Pearl Harbor that brought the United States into the Second World War, Japan turned its focus to the Philippines. Why? Because of the body of water that the country's capital stood on, Manila Bay. Because of its location, it was a strategic resupply point for Japan's imperial ambition in the Pacific. After initial air attacks, the Imperial Japanese 14th Army's ground troops invaded at 2 points at Luzon, the main island in the Philippines archipelago. General MacArthur sent word to the U.S. government that he had 130,000 troops ready and able to push Japanese forces back. Yet this was a gross and tragic exaggeration of the men at Luzon. In reality, there were tens of thousands of Filipino reservists and only about 20,000 American troops. These were normal, garrison soldiers who were ill-trained and ill-equipped. As such, the Japanese invaders quickly overcame the Allied defenders, and MacArthur was forced to withdraw to the Bataan Peninsula. In their retreat, these young, inexperienced soldiers were already on half rations, having to supplement them with monkey meat and little rice. With no Air Force or Navy support and suffering from various diseases like malaria and dengue fever, MacArthur's troops still managed to hold out for nearly 100 days. However, after 3 grueling months of this, General Edward King, U.S. commander of all ground troops in Bataan, surrendered on April 9, 1942. With around 76,000 Filipino and American troops, this is the biggest army under American command to ever surrender. With tens and thousands of new potential prisoners of war, the Japanese army planned to first consolidate the prisoners to Balanga, the east coast of Bataan, then march them 31 miles north to the village of San Fernando. Then they would travel 25 miles by rail and then march another 9 miles to a former Philippine army post. The Japanese army was ill-prepared for what to do next, and there were several factors that led to the cruelty and exhaustion faced over the next 3 weeks by these prisoners on the notorious Bataan Death March. To begin, Japanese military leaders deeply underestimated how many troops would surrender and how many they would be able to capture. They were expecting about 25,000 troops to surrender, and instead, more than 75,000 surrenders happened in different groups at different times, scattered all over the peninsula. They also believed that the other side would fight longer and were not expecting such a sudden collapse on the American side. Critically, the Japanese troops looked down on these new prisoners as surrender was seen as highly dishonorable and cowardly in Japanese culture, leading to innumerable acts of cruelty. Furthermore, the Japanese estimated that this first leg of the trip would only take a day because Japanese troops averaged 25 miles a day, but U.S. troops usually did not march more than 15 to 20 miles and could barely keep up that pace in their condition. Most of the prisoners began the walk at the tip of Bataan and had to march the full 66 miles to their final destination. Conditions varied because it was clear that Japanese soldiers weren't sure what to do with so many prisoners of war. Some were simply told to surrender their weapons and march, whereas many others faced great cruelty. They were told to strip of anything of value, such as watches, rings, and even fountain pens, and then beaten. Japanese soldiers beat these prisoners incessantly, sometimes to move them along, sometimes just for sport. Those who dropped from exhaustion or sickness, fell behind, broke ranks to fetch water, or tried to escape, were bayoneted, shot, or beheaded. Men who couldn't get up the next morning to continue were often buried alive or beaten to death with the shovels of the ditch diggers, other prisoners who were forced to carve out graves along the way. Local Filipinos who attempted to aid the prisoners of war were often killed or beaten alongside them. At Balanga, conditions didn't improve. Though the imperial leaders planned to set up a hospital, the only medical care was provided by U.S. medical personnel who were prisoners themselves and had no supplies. The crowded and unsanitary conditions also spread diseases, especially dysentery, quickly. After the prisoners were congregated, the move to San Fernando began. Prisoners of war were arranged in groups of 100, and in columns they were marched to Orani, about 8 miles north of Balanga, to stay overnight. Though this was supposed to be the first food checkpoint, shortage of supplies meant they were fed only one serving of rice, and some of them were not fed at all and only given a cup of water. Then they were marched 15 miles to Lubao, where they were housed in an abandoned warehouse with a single water spigot and no sanitation facilities. After a day or so at Lubao, they were marched the remaining 8 miles to San Fernando. The prisoners were in dire straits by then, starving and physically drained, while Japanese guards continued to commit random acts of brutality, striking or bayoneting the prisoners for amusement. At Lubao, the prisoners faced slightly better conditions, now fed twice a day with better access to water. But renewed horrors awaited them on the next leg of their journey. The men were then hauled into pre-war train cars, more than 100 of them crammed into each boxcar meant for only 40. There, prisoners stood for hours in stifling heat. According to one survivor, they packed us in the cars like sardines, so tight you couldn't sit down. Then they shut the door. If you passed out, you couldn't fall down. If somebody had to go to the toilet, you went right there where you were. It was close to summer and the weather was hot and humid, hotter than Billy Blazes. We were on the train from early morning to late afternoon without getting out. People died in the railroad cars. After the harrowing train car rides, the prisoners of war were marched another 9 miles in a final trek to their destination, Prisoner of War Camp O'Donnell. Though the Japanese expected the march to only take a couple of days, the whole trip took 3 weeks and countless lives. Yet the truth remains blurry. Determining how many prisoners of war died on the death march is basically impossible. This is because nobody knows how many U.S. and Filipino troops were killed during the Japanese offensive itself before they surrendered. Many also escaped, but were subsequently killed. While estimates suggest about 600 to 650 American prisoners of war were killed during the march and its immediate aftermath, a staggering 5,000 to 10,000 Filipino prisoners of war were estimated to be killed. Out of around 22,000 American soldiers, only about 15,000 returned to the U.S., which marks a death rate of more than 30%. By comparison, the Allied prisoners of war held by the Nazis and other Axis powers during World War II suffered a death rate about 3%. Thus, by comparison, the Bataan Death March was 10 times as deadly for American prisoners of war. If you found this video educational and want to learn more, make sure to subscribe to our channel and to visit the Pacific Atrocities Education website, where you can learn more and find out how you can support the mission to make sure these untold stories come to light.